Hey there flock, I'm Mike from Epic Duck Studios and welcome to the Epic Hobby. Today I'm going to be painting Gorghadra from Privateer Press's Monster Apocalypse, specifically painting his skin. Now you can see prior to starting the video I already started base coating the model with sick green. I basically forgot to hit record on the camera, so you missed a lot of base coating. So I'm going to go ahead now and just finish this base coat up pretty quickly. Now I've chosen to create my own color scheme for my Planet Eaters here rather than follow the box art, so this is obviously not going to get you that Privateer Press look to the model. This is a very different approach to painting this miniature. That said, this green skin would translate really well to other things like orcs from Warhammer and so on. So one of the key tenets that I've found for comic style painting is to have really bright base coats. And the reason for that is I'm going to be bringing in a lot of black ink later, and having a nice bright base coat makes sure as much of the color kind of survives that inking process as possible. What I mean by that is if I painted this with a normal sort of darker base coat color and maybe added some shadows in, what would happen is when I start bringing all the black in, the entire tone of the piece would start to come down a lot. It would look just much more dark in general. So by having the base coats be significantly brighter than they normally would be with a more traditional approach to miniature painting, it kind of averages out once all the black is in there. Now, having said that, because Gorghadra is a much bigger piece than the Belcher or the Crawler in the background, I am going to add a little bit of shadow, and I'll be doing that shortly. Alright, now with the base coat done here, what I want to do is start adding some shadows to this piece. Because Gorghadra is much larger than the Crawler or the Belcher, I want to add just an extra layer of depth to the skin. So I'm going to experiment here. I'm going to be using a little bit of some dark purple and a little bit of darker blue as well. Specifically Vallejo Game Color Royal Purple and Citadel Macragge Blue. Now I've chosen both of these colors because I do find the shadow is a really good place to bring in a complementary color as opposed to just adding a darker green, which would then kind of transition into the black and just get lost. This lets me add a little bit of tonal variation to the model, which just makes it more interesting overall. You can see though I'm bringing a little bit of green into the purple, just try and make a midway tone so that it's not starkly purple, it's just a little bit of a tint away from where the green is. Now you can see as I mix the purple and green together, it starts to form a very grayish color, and that's really what complementary colors do, is they do kind of balance out to gray. So I'm going to try just a little bit on the model here, but I do ultimately decide I don't like how this looks. And you can see here already, it's just a little bit too gray and a little bit too dark. And it's just not enough steps removed from the black ink that's going to be coming later. And I don't want just dark shadow on dark shadow. I want some distinction between the two. So I'm going to just leave this here and test it, but I am now going to mix up a little bit of the sick green with the Macragge Blue and see if I like that better. Now you can see with this mix, I'm also leaning much closer to the green than the blue. And I think that's really important, that I don't want this shadow on the skin to really be too many steps removed from the existing skin tone. So you can already get a good feel for how this shadow looks. It's pretty subtle, it is very close in tone to the existing green. It's just a little bit darker and a little bit cooler. And, it's definitely not going to be confused visually with the black at all, and that's really key, is that this is just a little bit darker and a little bit tonally different from the existing green skin tone. And like I say, on a smaller model, you can skip this step entirely, and you really can here too if you just want to save some steps. But it doesn't take long to lay this down, and because it's just a larger piece, it does help fill those volumes out a little bit. So you can see as I work my way around the model, I'm really focusing this color around areas where, the armor plates and the flesh meet, and then just on the underside of any sort of the folds in the flesh. And of course, the complete underside of the arms and tail and so on, where just the entire piece would be in shadow. Anything that will eventually be black is being touched by this, and then everything sort of adjacent to that. So now that I'm just about adding the shadow, you can really start to see that even though it's not a whole lot darker than the existing base coat, it does do a lot to really build the shapes and volumes of the miniature. It's really helping to add some weight and some volume to the model. And what I mean by that is, it really deepens the folds in the skin and so on, and so it makes the model look less flat. And because we are working with flat colors, that's actually really important. So now I'm going to begin highlighting the skin, and I'm going to be doing that with a much brighter green, in this case Reaper Dungeon Slime. I just absolutely love this color and its name, and it looks like what you think Dungeon Slime would look like, which is just fantastic. I am going to initially bring some of the Vallejo Sick Green into it, mix that about 50-50, and then I'll do a second highlight afterwards with just pure Dungeon Slime. So I find for me highlighting is where comic style painting starts to become really fun and different from normal painting, because you can see my highlights, nothing is being blended, nothing is smooth, there's no feathering, there's no glazing. I'm putting these highlights on in almost thick chunky layers, and I'm not using thick paint. I mean, you can't see clumps of it or my brush strokes or so on, but it's thick in that I'm using very opaque colors, and I'm really just giving it one or two passes, and I'm letting you see the shape of the brush stroke, which I mean, the outline of it. It's not feathered around the edges to make a nice smooth transition. It's literally where I've deposited the paint is the shape of that color. And that's really something I'm doing intentionally, because I want it to look like it's been done for a comic. I want it to look like someone has literally physically colored this in with, their Coptic markers or anything like that. And because of that, I want pretty sharp delineations between each of the colors as opposed to nice smooth blends. Now, there's a lot of different comics out there, and comics have evolved a lot over the years. And some of them rely on very, very smooth blends, and even some that you don't think do, use them in subtle ways. I've always personally loved the art of Mike Mignola, but I've always thought of his comics as being primarily black with very sharp splashes of solid opaque color. And then I went back and started looking at them really recently, kind of as research for some of this painting, and actually noticed that he uses a lot of very subtle fades in his work. You look at Hellboy, and in your head you probably, if you're familiar with Mike Mignola's art, you're probably thinking of like a very classic, almost all black, practically a silhouette of him with just certain facial details picked out in red. But when I went back to look at these comics, they're actually, it's not solid red, it's a red to orange transition, and it's very, very subtle, and sometimes the transition's only maybe the last 20% of it even. And in some cases it's not there at all. There are certainly areas of just a solid opaque color. but there are a couple little areas here and there where blends are introduced. And the whole reason for this ramble is just to say that if you want to do some blending, feel free, because it's certainly not outside the realm of comics to have a nice smooth blend of some colors. If you're looking at more of like a golden age comic, if you want to go back to the 50s, 60s, 70s, 80s, you're looking at much more solid blocks of color then. And if you go back far enough, you're not even looking at solid colors, you're looking at something called Ben-Day dots. And that's where the entire pinching process resolves around cyan, yellow, magenta, and black dots in different sizes. The same way your printer works, but at a much more macroscopic scale where you can literally count the dots if you want to. And that's become sort of a trend in pop art to emulate that, and it's certainly not something I recommend trying to do on a model. Anyway, that nice long ramble is over. Let's carry on adding some more highlights. This time I'm going to be using the pure dungeon slime to just really pick out some raised details now. So now with these bright dungeon slime highlights, I'm being very sketchy in a few areas. You can see specifically on the top of the thigh, where I've really let sort of some squiggly brush strokes be the defining shape. And the reason for that is I really want to try and imply a sense of movement to the model. And if everything was sort of nice and silhouetted and well-defined and sort of stationary in its shapes, if all of the sort of areas of paint were just these nice geometric patterns, it would make the model feel more like it was standing still, like everything was kind of settled in place. And by having the highlights be kind of a little bit jagged and uneven, and you can see here the brush is even a little bit split, and I'm just kind of working with that as a tool now. But by allowing these sort of highlights to be a little bit uneven and a little more brush stroke like, it's imparting a sense of motion into the miniature, because it kind of looks like things are just unsettled. You know, in comics, when you want to imply motion, you would often use speed lines, where you have sort of something very impactful happening around, say, a character's fist. You would see, you know, just sort of lines going away from the fist in the direction of motion. And of course, we can't do that on a model, because we can't have things just flying away from the model into space in 3D. It just doesn't work. You could make it work from a specific vantage point if you really wanted to, especially in a diorama, but as far as just on a solo model that you want to actually use for gaming purposes, that's not at all an option. And so by having these sort of broken up movement line-esque highlights, we can kind of bring some of that onto the model without directly doing so. Basically, the point I'm trying to make here is that even though I refer to this as comic style painting, there's some places where I do have to obviously deviate away from my sources of inspiration, because I'm working with a three-dimensional object that I want to look good from every possible angle, or at least as many as possible. And that's obviously not how the medium of comics work. And so there are things I have to do with this medium that you wouldn't really see in traditional comics, and you know, truly aren't from that, but sort of try to push your mental understanding of the model in that direction. Okay, the dungeon slime highlights are all done. Now I'm going to grab a little bit of P3 Mora white and just really add some extreme highlights to a few areas here. So now with the white, I'm using this opportunity to basically imply some texture to the surface of the skin because it is such a smooth surface. I'm breaking up how I apply this white highlight and kind of doing it in small little successive dots. And the idea to that is it makes the skin look just a little bit bumpy and uneven. It also helps exaggerate the idea I created with the dungeon slime that the model is in motion and is not stationary. Alright, that just about wraps up base coating, shading, and highlighting Gorghadra's skin. I am going to come back in a future video and apply black ink to all this, which will really bring out the comic style look. In the next video, I'll be detailing all of the metallic areas on the model, which is basically everything that's not skin. Hey, I hope you enjoyed this video. There's plenty more here on YouTube. You can also join me twice a week at twitch.tv/epicduckstudios on Thursday and Sunday evenings at 8 p.m. Eastern, where I do stream my painting live. If you want to support the show, you can do that at patreon.com/epicduck. Even giving as little as $1 a month helps keep the lights on and the paint flowing. You can also help by hitting subscribe here on YouTube or sharing this video with some friends. Thanks a lot!